senator has that right.
What is the pending business?
The pending business is H.R. 268, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 15, H.R. 268, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes.
I send a cloture motion to the desk for Senate Amendment number 5.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on Senate Amendment number 5 to H.R. 268, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I send a cloture motion to the desk for Senate Amendment number 6.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on Amendment number 6 to H.R. 268, an act making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30, 2019, and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I ask consent the mandatory quorum calls be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to S1.
The clerk will report the motion.
Motion to proceed to S1, a bill to make improvements to certain defense and security assistance provisions and so forth and for other purposes.
The senator from Louisiana.
Madam President, I'm sorry.
The Senate will be in order. The senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. As my colleagues know, we have about 41,000 active duty service members of the United States Coast Guard. They're running vital missions right now, Madam President, in the South China Sea. They're protecting our airspace and ports along about 12,000 miles of coastline. They're performing search and rescue missions. That includes nearly 1,200 active duty Coast Guard personnel in my home state of Louisiana, the 8th Coast Guard District.
The Senate will be in order so we can hear from the senator from Louisiana. Please take your conversations off the floor.
I would reiterate that the Senate is not in order, and the senator from Louisiana deserves to be heard on this important matter.
The gentleman is
so I would continue
correct.
to make that point of order.
The Senate will be in order. Members are asked to take your conversations off the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank the senior senator from Mississippi. Madam President, for that reason, I think the members of our Coast Guard need to be paid during this shutdown until we resolve our differences. We need to resolve our differences. There are some good members of Congress, but right now the American people are wondering what they're good for. And it seems to me that we ought to be able to reach an agreement that secures the border, which I happen to believe can't be done without a barrier, and which also opens government. And for that reason, Madam President, I ask for unanimous consent that the Coast Guard be paid, that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 6, H.J. Res. 1, that the Wicker Amendment at the desk be agreed to, that the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Democratic leader.
Reserving the right to object. President Trump is responsible not only for thousands of Coast Guard personnel not getting paid, but hundreds of thousands of other federal employees also not getting paid. Last week, I met with the Coast Guard Commandant, Commandant Schultz, and I told him to press Secretary Nielsen, who could press the President, to stop holding innocent federal employees hostage in wall negotiations. Now, last month, as we all know, the Senate voted unanimously to keep the government open into February, so all federal employees get paid and the President and Congress can separately negotiate border security. Today, the Senate will again have a chance to vote on the same measure that we passed unanimously in December. I expect that those who care about getting our Coast Guard paid will support passing H.J. Res. 31, a continuing resolution for the Department of Homeland Security, and H.R. 648, which are the conference bills for FSGG, Interior Environment, Agriculture, THUD, SFOPS, and CJS. So, Mr. President, would the senator from Louisiana modify his request to include the unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.J. Res. 648 and H.J. Res. 31 on block, that the measure be considered, read a third time, and passed on block, and the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no action or debate? That will pay all federal employees who deserve to be paid.
Madam President.
Does the senator so modify his request?
Madam President, reserving the right to object. I'm smiling because of the great admiration and respect I have for the senior senator from New York. I love to hear him talk.
It is mutual.
I love to hear him talk. He can talk the ears off a jackrabbit. He has waxed eloquently many times in this chamber. I remember back in 2005, 2006, Senator, I was a mere lad, but we had a bill before this chamber called the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And Senator Schumer, and then Senator, a rising star, Senator Obama, Senator Hillary Clinton, talked passionately and eloquently about how it was impossible to secure a 1,900-mile piece of real estate without barriers. They talked eloquently. I remember agreeing with them wholeheartedly that legal immigration makes our country stronger, that illegal immigration undermines legal immigration, and that one way to stop illegal immigration, not the only way, Madam President, but one way, was a border barrier. That was then. This is now. Now, my esteemed colleague knows full well that his resolution will not accomplish either border security or opening up of this government, because President Donald Trump is going to veto it. It will be a futile, useless exercise. Now, we can go through it if you want to. You can spend all day trying to teach a goat how to climb a tree, but you're better off hiring a squirrel in the first place. And there is a measure before this Senate. The President has put a proposal on the table that will satisfy many of the concerns of our Democratic friends and ensure border security. And for that reason, I object.
I wonder if the distinguished Democratic leader would yield under his reservation.
Is there objection to the original request?
I object to the original request because the senator from Louisiana has not allowed the rest of the federal government to get paid, and I would remind him, whether it's squirrel, jackrabbit, or armadillo, that we are the Article I branch of government, and because President Trump says no, we have veto override power. We could get the workers paid, even if he won't sign it. I object.
Madam President,
Objection is heard.
I was going to...
Senator from Mississippi.
I was going to ask the distinguished Democratic leader if he would yield under his reservation. Might I be recognized for just a moment? The the objection has already been heard, and we'll not get this done. But I appreciate the effort.
Does the senator from Louisiana yield the floor? Senator from
I appreciate the effort of the distinguished senator from Louisiana. His unanimous consent request would have done one simple thing, and that is get the uniformed service members in the Coast Guard paid just like we are today paying for members of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine. These are the only servicemen. The Coast Guard members are the only servicemen out there now who are required under the Uniform Code of Military Justice to perform their duties under pain of penalty, and they're not being paid as the others are. It would also protect survivors' benefits for the retirees and their survivors in the Coast Guard, as is being done with the other uniformed services. We're close. We may be getting close to a solution on this. I certainly hope so, Madam President. But in the meantime, I think it would be a significant gesture on the part of Democrats and Republicans in this Senate and in the House of Representatives to pass this one small change, which the President has said he will sign, and do the right thing by paying members of this uniformed service. So I regret that the gentleman has objected, and I appreciate having a chance at least to explain why this mere carve-out is different from a larger solution, which may be coming soon.
Madam President, I would simply once again remind my dear friend from Mississippi, we could do a whole lot more good by funding and opening up the government for everyone, and we should not, because President Trump, who has claimed he wants to shut down the government for his wall 25 times, and got this chamber to reverse itself when they had originally passed funding the whole government, we could do a lot more good if my amendment to my friend from Louisiana was adopted, and that's how it is. So now, on a different issue, I ask for the yeas and nays on the motion to proceed to S1.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Madam President, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent. Okay.
Madam President.
Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, I just want to explain a little bit of what we witnessed here on the Senate floor. It's actually can be a little bit confusing, but it's an important issue. Here, with regard to the Coast Guard, my colleague from Louisiana and Mississippi, we've been working on this issue for a while. It's not going to solve the whole partial government shutdown, but we've been working with a number of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. So right now, this bill that my friend from Louisiana asked to have unanimous consent on, right now has 23 co-sponsors. It might be more, actually more Democrat co-sponsors than Republican. Madam President, can you make sure the Senate's in order?
Senate will be in order.
So almost a quarter of the whole Senate, more Democrat co-sponsors than Republican co-sponsors, are co-sponsoring this bill to pay the Coast Guard. Now, again, we're working on the broader issue of getting our government back to work, paying federal workers. But as my colleagues mentioned, the Coast Guard is a rather unique situation because it's the only military service right now that's not getting paid. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, they're all getting paid. The Coast Guard men and women are out right now as we speak in my great state in Alaska, risking their lives for Americans, as they always do. But they're also out in other places like the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, literally running patrols in the Gulf side by side with Marines and sailors. The Marines and sailors are getting paid. The members of the Coast Guard aren't getting paid. And by the way, if the members of the Coast Guard say, you know what, I don't want to deploy to the Middle East right now, I'm not getting paid, I don't want to get on that ship to save an Alaskan crabber whose life is at risk, they get court-martialed. So the Coast Guard is in a very unique situation right now, Madam President, and here's the process that we just witnessed. So a number of us, again, very bipartisan, went to the President and said, Mr. President, we know it takes the Senate and the House and the White House to pass a bill. People are working on the broader issue. We're all working on the broader issue, the compromises we need. Hopefully we can get there this afternoon. But in the meantime, let's try to get something where we have almost a quarter of the Senate in agreement, more Democrats than Republicans, on this bill that Senator Kennedy just mentioned to pass. Would you support this? So a number of us had ongoing conversations with the President of the United States. I have raised this a number of times with him and his administration over the last 2 weeks. And in a meeting I had with him on Wednesday, he said, I'm 100% behind that bill. Okay, that's really important, because some of what the minority leader said we should be bringing up, the White House said we're not going to support that. Okay, that's difficult to pass a bill when you're not going to get the President to sign it. But the President will sign this bill. And almost 25% of the Senate has said they're already co-sponsors of this bill. So what just happened, for everybody watching, particularly the Coast Guard members, when I learned that the President was supportive last Thursday, we brought up this bill to the Senate floor and we hotlined it. That meant we're trying to move it through the Senate very quickly. Every Republican cleared that hotline, essentially meaning we all voted yes. When we brought it over to our colleagues on the other side, and look, I know my colleagues care a lot about the Coast Guard, Democrats, Republicans. When we brought it over, it was stalled. So we kept asking, come on, don't you want to support this? You got a bunch of co-sponsors. The men and women of the Coast Guard are very unique right now in terms of the military not getting paid. And there was just a delay. So what Senator Kennedy did is he said, I'm going to ask for live unanimous consent. Let's just bring it up and pass it. And pass it. The White House would sign it. We could fix this issue today. I bet most of the House would certainly vote for it. So what he did, he brought it up for unanimous consent, and the minority leader objected. Now, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to talk a lot about hostage taking with regard to federal employees. Well, I think they need to think a little hard about what just happened with regard to the men and women of the Coast Guard. Because right now, you heard it from the minority leader. He said he's not going to do anything for the Coast Guard, even though the President would sign it. We could fix this tonight because of the broader issue. Now, here's the point. We are all working on the broader issue. And we're going to vote on some things, and if they fail this afternoon, there's a number of us who are working on compromises to fix this whole problem. But in the meantime, Madam President, in the meantime, why shouldn't we all be working on an important issue? It might not be the whole government, an important issue to take care of the men and women of the Coast Guard. People who are literally risking their lives right now for Americans, not just in Alaska or Texas, all over the world, and they're the only members of the military not getting paid. We could fix it tonight. The President will sign it as we're working on the broader issue. I don't understand why that is not an acceptable path forward in talking to the men and women of the Coast Guard. Certainly in my state, they don't understand either. Yes, we got to come to a compromises on this broader issue that ends the partial government shutdown, gets our federal workers, all of them, back, secures our border, and we're all working on that. But in the meantime, had the minority leader of the United States Senate not objected, everybody here, I guarantee you, my Democratic colleagues, would have voted for this bill to pay the Coast Guard. It just doesn't make sense, Madam President, and I certainly hope my colleagues and my good friend from New York will reconsider their blocking of this bill, because we could fix at least one one element of this. And we need to fix it all, but in my view, a very unique element. Men and women who raise their hand to support and defend the Constitution and possibly die for this country are not getting paid, and yet the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines are. Let's fix it tonight. We can fix it tonight. Unfortunately, we just had an objection to doing that. I think it's a mistake, and I'm hopeful that my colleagues will reconsider it.
Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, I rise to strongly support the senator from Alaska and the senator from Louisiana and the senator from Mississippi. We should pay our Coast Guard. It is not right that we aren't paying the Coast Guard. Right now, every other military branch is being paid. The Army's being paid, the Navy's being paid, the Air Force is being paid, the Marines are being paid, but the Coast Guard is not being paid, even as they're risking their lives. Many of us in Texas and along the Gulf Coast saw the incredible heroism of the Coast Guard in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, where so many brave men and women risked their lives to save thousands upon thousands of innocents. They should be paid. And Madam President, I think it's important for the American people to understand what just happened here because it is highly consequential. It is easy for things to get lost in procedural gobbledygook. To assume, well, this is some back and forth about the shutdown, about the wall, has nothing to do with any of that. What Senator Kennedy asked, he brought forward a bill to pay the Coast Guard. It did nothing else. Didn't address any aspect of the shutdown, didn't address any aspect of the wall. It simply said, let's pay the men and women of the Coast Guard, yes or no. That means you can be a yes on that, whether you think we need to secure the border and have a steel barrier or whether you support open borders. It doesn't say anything either way. It just says the men and women of the Coast Guard deserve paychecks. We could have passed that right here today, and there's one reason and one reason only we didn't, because the Democratic leader stood up and said, I object. And I would note that if there are Democrats on the Democratic side of the aisle that are not comfortable with that, who agree that the Coast Guard should be paid, let me encourage my Democratic colleagues to say so, because it is their party's leader who has lodged an objection on behalf of effectively every Democratic senator. And what they are doing, the Democrats are fond of using the phrase hostage taking. They are quite literally holding the men and women of the Coast Guard hostage because they want to win a political victory against the president. Their objective here is have the president back down and have not a single mile of border wall built. Never mind that the Democratic leader and every Democrat in this chamber in 2013 voted to build and fund 350 miles of border wall. 350 miles every Democrat in this chamber voted for. We're in a shutdown today because they are now unwilling to fund 234 miles of border wall, less than they voted for in 2013. Now, we understand politics rears its head in this business, and the Democrats want to defeat the president politically, and so the substance is secondary to trying to get that partisan victory over the president. But let me suggest this ought to be an issue. We can keep fighting back and forth on whether securing the border or having open borders is a good idea. But this ought to be an issue that should be real simple. Senator Kennedy brought forward a clean bill that does one thing and one thing only. It pays the salaries of the Coast Guard. If the Democratic leader hadn't objected, that would have passed right now. The president could have signed it tonight. The paychecks could have gone out right now for every man and woman in the Coast Guard. So if you're serving in the Coast Guard, in any of our 50 states, let me say, number one, thank you for your service. Thank you for your heroism. Thank you for the amazing difference you make. You deserve to be paid. You will be paid. But if you want to know why you weren't paid, it is because the Democratic leader objected to your getting a paycheck. It is my hope that the Democratic senators will go to their leader and say, this is a bad idea. for Democratic senators to hold hostage the paychecks of the men and women of the Coast Guard. We should pay the Coast Guard, and that ought to be something that commands unanimous bipartisan support. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, just to